a horrific crime in an upscale London neighborhood. Compulsive thoughts are a mental disorder characterized by the occurrence of ideas and actions that occur against a person's will and from which they cannot free themselves. In some severe cases, these thoughts can literally take over the mind, and when combined with a complex manipulative nature, innate cruelty, and a manic desire for dominance, it creates a time bomb. British Sabrina Quieter had every chance of achieving the fabulous, rich, and carefree life she dreamed of from an early age, but it was never enough for her. No partner was good enough for her, and she constantly felt like she was born for fame, attention, and luxury. Her unrealized ambitions and obsessive fantasies eventually escalated into delusions with bouts of violence. Unfortunately, Sabrina found a defenseless man on whom she vented all her anger. This case became one of the most heinous and high-profile in British history. An innocent girl who cared for her children became the victim of a deranged sadist. Sabrina Quieter. Early years. Sabrina Quieter, born on December 5, 1982, in a London suburb, had a distinctive blend of French and Algerian heritage from her parents. This unique mix likely contributed to her striking appearance and fiery temperament. The eldest of 4 children, Sabrina was the darling of her family, constantly praised and set as a model for others. At the age of 2, her family emigrated to France, settling in Paris, where she spent most of her childhood and youth. Sabrina's complex character began to manifest in her school years. Her former classmates later recalled that she was arrogant, domineering, self-absorbed, and extremely selfish. She had few friends, either at school or among her neighborhood peers, considering everyone around her unworthy of her time. To other bright, outgoing girls, she was particularly hostile, viewing them as competitors and enemies. With her stunning looks, a striking brunette with brown eyes and an impressive figure, Sabrina could have pursued a career in modeling if she had the ability to connect with others rather than just seeking to manipulate them. As a child, she was active in sports and showed some interest in music during her youth, but her inconsistency, impatience for quick results, and lack of effort hindered her success in any field. Years later, Sabrina claimed she experienced harsh treatment from her maternal relatives in France during her early years. However, these claims were never substantiated or proven. Contrarily, her family insisted that she was indulged and always sought attention. As a teenager, while active in sports, Sabrina suffered a back injury, leading to a dependence on prescription painkillers. She tried to obtain these drugs illegally, leading to her arrest and a police warning. Sabrina was always intensely focused on herself and her appearance, craving constant attention. She had no doubt that her future held a wealthy, glamorous life filled with celebrity interactions and her own stardom. Sometimes it seemed her fantasies clouded her reality as she believed her rightful place was in Hollywood. Sabrina graduated from the Sorbonne with a degree in English and French literature. However, since 2006, she claimed various fashion industry professions such as stylist, makeup artist, fashion designer, or designer, though she lacked real expertise in these areas. Complex relationship with Wissem Medouni. Sabrina Quieter, known for her stunning looks, had a penchant for captivating men and exploiting their affection, but she never saw any of her suitors as worthy of a serious relationship. She was literally waiting for a prince who would completely obey her. After finishing school, Sabrina was still unclear about her life goals, feeling entitled to everything without effort. Nevertheless, she enrolled at the prestigious Sorbonne University and simultaneously worked at a sweet shop for financial support. It was there, at the age of 18, that she met Wissem Medouni. Medouni, 6 years her senior, was a manager at a major French company's head office and studied at one of Paris's most prestigious universities. He aspired to a master's degree for career advancement. Despite not being particularly handsome, part of elite clubs, or in the celebrity circle, he fell deeply in love with Sabrina and was willing to fulfill all her whims and fancies. Sabrina, too, found Medouni appealing, seeing him as someone she could manipulate yet also as a ticket to a wealthy life. He was ambitious and capable of great career success and was ready to pamper and spoil her. The couple began dating in 2000 and within a few months decided to move in together. Sabrina quickly revealed her true nature, striving to control Medouni in every aspect. If her demands were not met, she resorted to tantrums, manipulations, and even physical violence. Moreover, she soon started openly cheating on Meduni, not bothering to hide it or justify her actions. She could engage in flings with anyone, from a random acquaintance to Meduni's best friend or colleague. Despite several attempts to end the relationship and leaving her, Meduni always returned, unable to break free from his deep love for Sabrina. In 2001, Meduni achieved his master's degree and a significant promotion. He began earning a substantial income, which he spent lavishly on Sabrina's luxurious clothing and entertainment. His family owned several properties in Paris, and he managed them, giving all the rental income to Sabrina. Meduni, who also had Franco-Algerian roots, saw a kindred spirit in Sabrina. According to some reports, in the fall of 2001, the couple married in a special Muslim ceremony, evidenced by a certificate issued by the Argenteuil Mosque. However, this religious ceremony was insufficient to make the union official and legal. The couple had a son, whose paternity Meduni officially recognized. However, years later, a Frenchman named Anthony Francois claimed he was the child's father. Francois, a witness in Queter's trial, described her as volatile, unpredictable, promiscuous, and manipulative. Relocation to London. In 2008, the global financial crisis hit hard, leading to the bankruptcy of the company where Wissem Meduni worked, resulting in the loss of his high-paying job. It was around this time that Sabrina Queter developed a fixation on moving to London. She made the move without much consultation with her partner. Left with little choice and hoping for a new career start in one of the world's major financial hubs, Meduni followed her to London. Once in London, Meduni found employment in a major English bank. However, Sabrina struggled to find her footing in the fashion industry. Her aspirations to become a designer, model, or makeup artist were hindered by a lack of skills, experience, and formal education in these fields. Consequently, she had to lower her expectations. Over time, she worked in various capacities, including as a nanny, in a call center, a cafe, and even tried her hand at network marketing. Romance with Mark Walton. Sabrina Queter's quest for love took a turn when she rekindled her teenage passion for music, adding the titles of musician and composer to her resume. Despite her enthusiasm, Sabrina struggled to find professional opportunities in the music industry. She attended numerous auditions and social events, hoping to make valuable connections. At one of these events, Sabrina fortuitously met Mark Walton, a renowned musician, songwriter, and one of the founding members of the famous Irish boy band, Boyzone. After leaving the group, Mark became a successful producer and music mogul, collaborating with artists like Jennifer Lopez, Jessica Simpson, and Lady Gaga. By 2016, his net worth had exceeded $1 billion. Mark was precisely the kind of person Sabrina had dreamt of meeting, her ticket to a world of fame and luxury. She managed to impress Mark with her beauty and charisma. He was captivated by her and openly admitted falling in love at first sight, unable to think of anyone but the stunning woman. Their relationship progressed rapidly, and Sabrina made efforts to remain pleasant and endearing, quickly ending her relationship with Meduni as she saw a promising future with Mark. His previous relationship and child were no deterrent for her. Within weeks, the lovers moved in together, residing in a luxurious house in an upscale area of London. Mark took on all the expenses, including the rent for the lavish house chosen by Sabrina. For several months, Sabrina lived the opulent life she had long aspired to, socializing with celebrities, attending elite events, wearing couture clothing, and even appearing in glossy magazines. However, managing Mark proved challenging for Sabrina, as she feared losing him. She couldn't control her nature for long and soon began to show jealousy towards every woman around Mark. Sabrina's demands increased over time, seeking more gifts and luxury. Mark indulged her with designer clothes, jewelry, and outings to high-end restaurants and clubs, but it was never enough for her. The couple's home had a high turnover of staff and nannies, as Sabrina's paranoia led her to believe they were either stealing or attempting to seduce Mark. Her irrational behavior eventually drove Mark to his breaking point. In 2011, he ended the relationship and left for California, leaving Sabrina with nothing. Losing Mark also meant losing the lavish lifestyle she had enjoyed. Sabrina started giving interviews, accusing Mark of cruelty, violence, and substance abuse. She called him, crying, begging him to return, and even threatened to take her own life, but none of these tactics brought him back. Who is the father of the second child? After realizing she had lost Mark Walton, Sabrina Kuiter reached out to her ex-partner, Wisem Maduni. Maduni, whose career was flourishing as a bank executive, immediately forgave and accepted her back, still harboring feelings for her. They resumed living together. Shortly after reuniting with Maduni, Sabrina discovered she was pregnant. She quickly informed Walton, who, through his lawyers, expressed willingness to provide for the child and Sabrina, offering a monthly allowance. However, Walton insisted on a paternity test post-delivery to confirm his fatherhood. Sabrina's refusal to undergo the test, which could have secured her substantial regular payments, hinted at her uncertainty about the child's paternity. Instead of agreeing to the test, she demanded Walton double the proposed allowance. Upon his refusal, she declared war on the musician. Sabrina took to social media, spreading false claims that Walton was obsessed with her, insanely jealous of Maduni, and was physically threatening them. She accused Walton of breaking into their home, assaulting Maduni, scaring the children, and sexually assaulting her in unnatural ways. However, she couldn't substantiate her claims as Walton had a solid alibi, being in the United States since their breakup. After Walton filed a defamation lawsuit and the police threatened action against her, Sabrina temporarily ceased her accusations against the ex-boyfriend. She settled in Wimbledon, southwest London, with Maduni and their 2 children, leading a seemingly quiet life as the conflict appeared to be resolved. French nanny Sabrina Kuiter, unaccustomed to managing household chores and finding it challenging to handle 2 children, decided to hire a nanny who could also assist with housework. She posted a job advertisement online and personally conducted interviews. Most candidates did not meet her expectations, and those who did not stay long in her household. A young French woman named Sophie Lyonnais responded to the advertisement. At the time, 19-year-old Sophie was in her provincial hometown in France, so the interview was conducted via video call. This modest, unassuming provincial agreed to all terms: childcare, household help, and cooking for a symbolic weekly pay of 50 British pounds, including full board and lodging with the employer. Sophie was born on January 7, 1996, in the small town of Troyes, situated between Auxerre and Sens. Her parents, Catherine and Patrick Lyonnais, were simple workers, leading a modest, if not poor, lifestyle. After finishing school, Sophie obtained a diploma in childcare but did not wish to work in her province, aspiring instead to move to a big city. Known for being shy, quiet, and plain in appearance, but very kind and open-hearted, Sophie was loved by those who knew her. Due to poor vision, she wore glasses, which she was somewhat self-conscious about. During their conversation, Kuiter realized that Sophie, the plain Jane, would be an ideal target for her manipulations. Moreover, Sophie was eager to gain experience and good references, thus willing to work for minimal wages. To Sophie, Sabrina seemed like a serious and reliable employer, a fact she shared with her parents before departing for London. As kind employers turned into sophisticated sadists. Initially, things seemed to go well for Sophie Lyonnais, who naively believed that working for the Kuiters would be an excellent start to her nanny career. She quickly bonded with the children, managed household chores as per her contract, and had enough time and resources to improve her English and explore city attractions. This peaceful period lasted several months and all seemed well. Problems began when Maduni lost his job, and the family's only stable income became the monthly child support payments from Walton. Sabrina again demanded increased payments from Walton, who in turn requested a DNA test to confirm his paternity. The family faced serious financial issues, struggling with expensive rent and basic living expenses. Sabrina, unwilling to cut back on her luxuries and desperate to maintain her socialite lifestyle, became irritable and aggressive, often taking out her anger on the young nanny. The couple attempted to start a bakery business with their last funds, but it failed. Sabrina then turned to Walton asking for a substantial amount of money to launch her clothing line, only to be met with a categorical refusal, leading to tears and complaints about poverty. Sabrina frequently complained to Lionel about her ex-lover, and the nanny tried to console her employer. What happened next varies depending on the source. According to one version, Huiter conceived a plan to use Sophie as a weapon for blackmailing Walton. She intended to portray Sophie as Walton's accomplice and lover, supposedly planted in their home to disrupt their lives and endanger the children. Sabrina claimed that the provincial fool was in love with Walton, who used her as a tool for revenge. She believed that recording the nanny's confessions on tape or video and presenting them to the police would be sufficient evidence to demand compensation from Walton for his heinous act. However, Sophie refused to give false statements on camera. Another version, as argued by Huiter's lawyers in court, suggested that due to her mental disorder, Sabrina genuinely believed in her conspiracy theory and saw Sophie as an enemy and a threat to her family. She allegedly didn't force the nanny to give false testimony, but truly believed Sophie was Walton's accomplice, infiltrated into their household to harm them. Regardless of the truth, Sophie's life soon turned into a living nightmare. Torture chamber in the basement of a wealthy home. Initially, young Frenchwoman Sophie Lyonnais was burdened with extra work without a corresponding increase in her meager salary. Eventually, she was engaged in endless chores from dawn till late night, with no personal time and effectively imprisoned within the house walls. Sophie's pay was soon halted entirely, and to prevent her escape or return to France, her employers confiscated her passport, making her a captive. Her communication with family was strictly monitored. The situation worsened. Sophie was barely fed and constantly pressured to give false statements against Walton, whom she had never met or known. She was communicated with solely through screams, insults, and threats. Accused of stealing money and valuables, she was threatened with imprisonment if she failed to comply with their demands against the musician. When screaming and blackmail proved ineffective, the Huiters resorted to more brutal and sophisticated methods. Sophie was effectively relocated to a cold basement, where she spent all her time when not working. Fed scantily once or twice a day, she became emaciated and weak. However, the cold and hunger were not the worst she endured. Physical abuse became the most torturous stage. It started with slaps and hair pulling, but escalated when Sabrina broke Sophie's nose in a violent assault. The sight of blood seemingly unleashed Sabrina's fury, turning beatings into a daily ordeal for Sophie. Each day brought new methods of cruelty designed to inflict unbearable pain and suffering. The basement of this wealthy house in an affluent London area turned into a real torture chamber for Lionel, with no hope of rescue. Strange visit to the police station. In late summer 2017, Sabrina Huiter brought the unfortunate Sophie Lionel to a police station, claiming that Sophie was ready to testify against Mark Walton, with whom she allegedly had a romantic and criminal relationship, and who had supposedly sent her to their house to abuse the children. However, Sophie remained silent, refusing to say what Sabrina demanded. The police decided to speak with Sophie privately and took her to a separate room. Sabrina was furious, fearing that Sophie would reveal the horrors happening at their home and implicate her and her husband. Mysteriously, Sophie chose not to disclose anything or seek help. The police's response was also peculiar. Despite seeing a malnourished, frightened, and weakened young woman, they did not call a doctor or a psychologist to ensure her well-being and safety. At that point, the 21-year-old nanny weighed less than 40 kilograms, had partially lost her hair, was missing a front tooth, and was noticeably limping. Yet none of this raised any concern with the officers, who simply let everyone go home. Disturbing phone call and a funeral pyre. In mid-September, Sophie Lyonnais made her final call to her mother. Sobbing, Sophie confessed to her mother that she wanted to return home but had no money. Catherine, without delving into details, simply told her daughter that she would buy her a ticket and ask her to pack her bags immediately. This was the last time she would hear Sophie's voice. A few days later, on September 20th, 2017, in the evening, the Huiters' neighbors called the police. They were alarmed by a fire in the yard, not so much by the fire itself, but by the nauseating, sweetly greasy smell emanating from it. A neighbor said he immediately realized it smelled like burning flesh and hair, along with something unidentifiable, and the thick smoke that stretched half a block instantly impregnated clothes and skin with this stench. Firefighters and a police car arrived at the scene. The house owners, appearing calm and seemingly unaware of the reason for the emergency services visit, met them. After extinguishing the fire, what looked like a charred human hand was discovered in the ashes. The couple was immediately taken into custody, and severely burnt human remains were extracted from the fire. The gender and age of the deceased were indeterminable, but soon the body was identified as Sophie Leonet's, recognized by the melted metal frame of the glasses embedded in the skull, which Sophie always wore. Cause of death. Determining the cause of Sophie Leonet's death was challenging, as her body was almost entirely destroyed by fire. Forensic experts found multiple rib fractures, jaw cracks, and evidence of blunt force trauma on her skull and limbs, indicating she had suffered these injuries while still alive. Additionally, several of her teeth were missing, and her nose was severely damaged. It became clear that Sophie had endured prolonged and brutal beatings, resulting in broken bones and knocked-out teeth. However, assessing the state of her internal organs and identifying any penetrating wounds was impossible due to the extent of the fire damage. The discovery of horrific video recordings in the house, showing Sophie being tortured and coerced into confessing collusion with Walton and intent to harm the children, revealed the true sadistic nature of her captors. Sophie was beaten with fists, an iron cord, a golf club, and even subjected to electric shock torture. She also endured humiliations, such as being forced to submerge her head in a toilet until she began to suffocate. According to experts, Sophie likely died from asphyxiation before being burned on the pyre, sparing her from the agony of being alive during the burning. Trial and sentence. Sabrina Kuiter and Wissem Medouni denied guilt and displayed no remorse for their brutal crime. After the murder, Medouni calmly went to a nearby supermarket to buy firelighter fluid for burning the body and dinner for his family, behaving as if nothing unusual had happened. The first court hearings against the sadistic couple began in March 2018. Sabrina tried to portray herself as a victim, blaming Mark Walton for driving her to a pathological state with his relentless torment. Medical examinations confirmed Sabrina had mental disorders but was not insane and could comprehend her actions. Wissem, physically healthy, was psychologically dependent on Sabrina, dominated and blindly obedient to her. A former lover of Sabrina, testifying in court, described her as a cunning manipulator, not a madwoman, as she calculated her moves too shrewdly. Another witness stated she always fabricated enemies, but did so rationally, with selfish motives. On June 26, 2018, the court found the couple guilty of torturing, humiliating, and murdering their nanny under aggravating circumstances. They were sentenced to life imprisonment, eligible for parole only after 30 years. Neither admitted guilt, continuously appealing to mitigate their sentences. Sabrina attempted to feign insanity, hoping to move from prison to a hospital, but was unsuccessful. Mark Walton, present at the trial, expressed guilt over his ex-lover's actions, as she committed these atrocities to gain his attention and financial compensation. He offered his deepest condolences to the victim's parents and voluntarily issued a substantial check to support the grief-stricken family who lost their beloved daughter. Law enforcement officers are tasked with protecting the legal rights and interests of the citizens of their country, ensuring public order safety, and identifying and stopping any violations. Theoretically, the charter and principles of law enforcement operations sound flawless, but in real life, there are cases that literally make your blood run cold when people, who are meant to serve and protect, violate the law themselves or cover up for those who do. Such wrongful actions often lead to real criminal schemes, resulting in severe consequences. The case of Valeria Vivanco, a police officer who died in the line of duty, gained widespread resonance not only in Chile, where the tragic events unfolded, but also in the media of other countries. Essentially, the young woman's life was ended by a colleague who was supposed to protect her and ensure her safety. The most horrifying aspect was that the higher authorities knew about this and attempted to distort the facts, accusing another person of the incident, and hiding the real circumstances of the event. Although the actual culprit of the tragedy was identified and even sentenced to a real prison term, the motive behind his actions remains unclear, whether it was a tragic accident or if it was deliberate. Moreover, it's puzzling why he was covered and defended by high-ranking individuals for so long. Even after it seemed the guilty party had faced punishment, the Supreme Court, upon reviewing an appeal, shocked the victim's family with its unexpected decision. Who was Valeria Vivanco? Valeria Fernanda Vivanco was born on May 29, 1996, in the small commune of La Granja, located near the city of Santiago, the capital of Chile, and was the youngest of 3 children in the simple family of Miguel and Jacqueline Vivanco. She was raised alongside her older biological brother Michelangelo and sister Daniela. The family patriarch worked for a company involved in the transportation of passengers and goods, while her mother was a homemaker dedicated to raising her children and creating a cozy home environment. When Valeria started school, her parents decided to separate. This was a huge shock for the girl, and although the ex-spouses continued to communicate post-divorce, and the father remained actively involved in the lives of his children from his first marriage, including providing financial support, the youngest daughter harbored resentment towards him. They occasionally argued, sometimes not speaking for months, but they always reconciled. Miguel Vivanco remarried soon after, and Valeria gained 2 more half-siblings with whom she, as well as Daniela and Michelangelo, maintained warm family relations. Jacqueline never remarried, raised her children, and later took care of her grandchildren, gifted to her by her older offspring. From an early age, Valeria demonstrated a strong-willed character, determination, and incredible perseverance in all her endeavors. She excelled in school, engaged in sports, was courageous and just, and was always ready to help others, sometimes even at risk to herself. It was likely this desire to assist those around her, protect the vulnerable, and stand up for justice that led her to pursue a career in the police force. After successfully completing high school, Valeria enrolled in the police academy in Santiago. She graduated with honors, becoming an investigator, and having received her diploma in 2016 at the age of 20, joined the Chilean police force the following year. She began her service in the bureau investigating especially serious crimes located in the capital. From the first days of her service, young Valeria proved herself to be a dedicated law enforcement officer and a true fighter for justice. She loved her job, performed her duties diligently, and was ready to rush anywhere at any time if required by her service. She could leave in the middle of the night to respond to a crime scene, chased after criminals, risking herself, and sometimes had to act as a psychologist when interacting with people who had lost loved ones. Colleagues described Vivanco as kind, cheerful, and friendly, yet she was a true professional and a reliable partner. She served in the police force for almost 5.5 years, during which she received a vast number of accolades, awards, and actively advanced in her career, earning the respect of her colleagues and the admiration of the leadership. Additionally, she represented her department in Spain, spending about 2 weeks in Madrid on an official visit. She was immensely proud to be entrusted with such responsible missions. By 2020, she had been promoted to assistant inspector, the new young colleague. In January 2020, a new member was welcomed to the precinct where Valeria worked, 21-year-old Lionel Alejandro Contreras Canales. Fresh out of the police academy, Valeria effectively became his mentor at his first job. A few months later, they became partners and initially got along pretty well. Little is known about Lionel's early years. Some information suggests he came from a rather influential and affluent family, but a high-ranking official as his uncle. Growing up in comfort, never wanting for anything, Lionel was quite self-centered, believing everything should go his way. Valeria quickly caught the eye of her new colleague and partner as he made various attempts to show her attention, tried to court her, and even asked her out a few times, but was met with firm rejection each time. Valeria took her job very seriously, considered workplace romances inappropriate, and was quite strict with the young co-worker, seeing him as immature. The issue wasn't so much the age difference — Lionel was only 3 years younger — as it was his behavior, which Valeria found childish but hoped to help him mature. In July 2020, Valeria and her young partner were involved in apprehending robbers who had stolen money from a store's cash register. The criminals, not having left the scene and armed, initiated a shootout, during which both were fatally engaged by Lionel. Although casualties could have been avoided, Lionel's actions were not deemed excessive for apprehending the individuals. However, this incident strained the relationship between the partners. The last birthday. On May 29, 2021, Valeria celebrated her 25th birthday. The celebration took place at her mother's house, attended by many guests including relatives, friends, and work colleagues. Lionel, however, was not among the invited. Valeria, aiming to avoid potential awkwardness, chose not to invite her young partner, who had recently attempted to court her again. Valeria tried to talk to him about this, but he only repeated his affections for her, which she did not want other colleagues to find out about. Despite the large turnout, gifts, heartfelt congratulations, and warm wishes, the birthday girl seemed upset, though she tried to smile. The reason was a recent argument with her father, leading to days without communication. Valeria hoped her father would attend her birthday, allowing them to reconcile, but the likely angered parent only sent a terse congratulatory message, not even calling. Jacqueline noticed her daughter's distress and knew the reason behind her hidden sadness. Angry at her ex-husband's actions, she believed Miguel would eventually call Valeria, talk things out, and reconcile as they always had before. Unfortunately, the father and daughter never got the chance to talk again, as 2 weeks later, Valeria tragically lost her life while on duty. The fatal shot. On June 13, 2021, Valeria was on night duty, participating in street patrols and vehicle checks. This was not a standard procedure, but a search for suspects related to the crime against a young woman that had occurred the previous day in a suburb of the capital. There was an alert for a white Kia Cerrado, believed to be driven by a suspected criminal. The suspect likely had a weapon and might not have been alone in the car. Valeria was in a patrol car with her partner Lionel, driven by Deputy Commissioner Felipe Guillardo Araya. They spotted the suspect's vehicle and initiated a pursuit without waiting for backup. The officers managed to intercept and block the suspect's escape. Penales and Vivanco exited their vehicle, weapons drawn, and called for the offenders to surrender and exit their car with their hands up. At that moment, a single shot rang out, and as everyone tried to understand who fired and where, Valeria, clutching her side, fell to the asphalt next to the police car. Reinforcements arrived just then, so her colleagues heard the shot and saw that she was wounded, but couldn't fully grasp what had happened and who had fired. The criminals, seizing the moment of confusion, accelerated and fled the scene while the injured officer was being administered first aid. Despite the rapid arrival of medics and her colleagues' efforts to stem the bleeding, Valeria could not be saved. She was rushed to the nearest hospital, where top specialists fought for her life for several hours. However, due to severe blood loss and damage to vital organs, she passed away on the operating table without regaining consciousness. When her family was informed, her parents, brothers, and sisters immediately rushed to the hospital, but by then, the wounded officer had already died. Miguel was not just stricken with grief, but utterly devastated, as he had not had the chance to speak and reconcile with his beloved daughter, with whom he had had a petty argument last. He felt a profound sense of guilt toward her, so shaken by the event that he himself required medical attention to prevent a heart attack. The search and arrest of the suspects. According to the official version, Vivanco died in the line of duty during an operation to catch dangerous criminals. She was hailed as a hero who gave her life for the peace and safety of others. This incident was widely covered in local media, with reporters vividly describing the young officer's heroism and self-sacrifice. The investigation was handled by specialists from the Homicide and Major Crimes Division, where Valeria herself had worked. They concluded that she died from a shot to the abdomen, fired by someone facing her from the direction of the suspect's vehicle she was pursuing with her colleagues. Everything seemed logical, with witnesses corroborating the story, making it appear that the case was solved, and all that remained was to find and punish the culprits who were still at large and possibly on the run. Soon after, the suspects were apprehended, generating widespread public attention. The criminals turned out to be 19-year-old Miguel Alejandro Cañupan and his 17-year-old accomplice, whose name was withheld due to his minor status, both previously convicted for minor offenses. The then president of Chile, Miguel Juan Sebastián Piñera Echenique, issued an official statement promising that the perpetrators would be brought to justice with all the rigor of the law. Something doesn't add up. After the autopsy and all necessary examinations were conducted, the body of the deceased Vivanco was handed over to her family and was buried with honors at one of the capital's cemeteries. Hundreds of people came to pay their last respects, expressing their sincere condolences to the girl's family. According to Jacqueline and Miguel, the entire ordeal seemed like a horrific dream, and they hardly remembered the events of the funeral day. Among the men carrying Valeria's coffin was her colleague Lionel, who appeared to mourn her more than anyone else. However, according to other colleagues, there had been some tension between the partners lately, to the extent that the girl didn't even invite the young man to her birthday celebration. Almost immediately after the funeral, court proceedings began regarding the suspects who were apprehended the day after the incident and were in custody. At that moment, everyone was confident that the culprits were caught, and proving their guilt seemed straightforward, especially since they began to give confessional testimonies. However, it soon became clear that the investigation had been flawed from the start, with critical details overlooked and key findings from forensic experts downplayed. The process was mishandled, and high-ranking officials tried to conceal the identity of the true culprit behind the girl's demise. Thus, about a month and a half after the officer's death, the case took an unexpected turn. By the end of July, 2 employees were suspended from their duties, allegedly involved in the incident leading to Valeria's death. On August 1st, the deceased girl's parents were called to the capital's prosecutor's office for a meeting on an important matter. The parents thought that new evidence had emerged in their daughter's case and that the detainees, awaiting their final sentence, would finally receive deserved punishment. However, the grief-stricken Jacqueline and Miguel were shocked to learn that their daughter died from a bullet fired by her colleague. This was personally communicated to them by prosecutor Juan Carlos Carrasco, who also conveyed his condolences and apologies on behalf of the entire investigative department. Valeria's parents were bewildered. They couldn't believe their ears and couldn't understand how such a thing could happen. They relived their grief anew and wanted clarification on the situation and why this information only became known so much later. As it turned out, that single fatal shot came from the service weapon in the hands of one of the girl's colleagues. This was confirmed by a ballistics examination conducted that same day, but its results were somehow distorted, and the bullet extracted from the body was sent to the evidence locker with entirely different characteristics: shape, caliber, weight, etc. Furthermore, the bullet had exited through and through, and it was not extracted from the body. The entry and exit wounds in the forensic reports were accidentally or intentionally confused. That is, the bullet did not enter through the abdomen and exit through the back, but quite the opposite. The shot was fired at her back. Some pages from the autopsy report were missing, while others were clearly altered and replaced. Additionally, the detainees, over whom the trial was proceeding and who supposedly confessed to their guilt and were about to be imprisoned, started filing complaints. They claimed that their confessions were coerced through torture and threats, and the pistol they had on them that evening wasn't even loaded. Moreover, their involvement in the earlier crime which prompted the interception plan that fateful night was also unconfirmed. New suspects. In a twist, Vivanco went from being seen as a tragic hero who died in the line of duty to a victim of betrayal, killed by her own colleagues. Given the new circumstances, the primary suspects became Felipe Giliardo Araya, who was driving the police car, and Valeria's partner, Lionel Alejandro Contreras Canales, who was seated in the back. Both suspects were immediately suspended from duty. Thus, on August 5th, it became known that the bullet that killed Valeria was fired from a service weapon. Subsequently, a document emerged with the results of the examination, indicating that only Canales had gunshot residue on his hands, making him the prime suspect. Notably, this finding had not been mentioned anywhere before, as if it never existed. Several other reports concerning the ballistics examination and the pathologist's conclusions were improperly filed and ended up in an archive box, which was never adequately checked. Whether this was an accident, criminal negligence, or intentional concealment of crucial facts was yet to be determined. Now the police officers who participated in the operation to apprehend the criminals themselves became suspects in the murder of their colleague. They, along with the previously arrested perpetrators, took part in a reenactment of the events of that night. Philippe claimed that from the driver's seat, he could only see Valeria, who was seated next to him in the front passenger seat and was the first to exit the car. Lionel was sitting behind and also exited the vehicle, but his actions could not be seen by the driver. Valeria had only taken a few steps when a shot was fired. She fell, and the suspect's car they were chasing sped away. Lionel then rushed to the injured woman to provide first aid. Lionel claimed that he and his partner exited the patrol car almost simultaneously, but she immediately rushed forward when the shot was fired. He insisted that he did not shoot his colleague, and the driver should have seen and confirmed this. He also confirmed that he was the first to rush to Valeria's aid and tried to compress her wound. Despite differences in the direct participants' testimonies, the reconstruction showed that Canales was behind his partner at the moment of the shot, and the bullet's trajectory matched his location. He was also the only person found with gunshot residue on his hands. Possible motives for the crime. After previously hidden reports and examination results were released, Lionel was taken into custody as the primary suspect, while the young men previously detained were released under a non-exit agreement, as there was effectively nothing to charge them with. However, the motive behind the young officers' actions remained unclear. The first and main theory was that the entire incident was a tragic accident. Supposedly, the young and inexperienced officer discharged his weapon unintentionally while standing behind his partner. He panicked, tried to help her, and when turning in his service weapon that day, insisted he hadn't fired it. However, the truth quickly surfaced, and influential relatives of the young man, using all their power, money, and connections, attempted to suppress the incident. Hence the cleaned reports, missing documents, confusion in the evidence, and coerced testimonies from the detained. Another theory, partially confirmed by Lionel himself, was that he was unrequitedly in love with Valeria and desperately sought her attention, but all his efforts were in vain. Over time, he began to merely irritate the girl, who didn't even invite him to her birthday party attended by the entire department. The shot in the back was his revenge for the rejection. A third theory, proposed by the deceased's relatives, suggested that Valeria discovered something she wasn't supposed to know, some corruption scheme, official crimes, or something similar. As an honest and fair person, she would undoubtedly have exposed the culprits, which is why she was eliminated, and young Lionel was chosen as the executor, promised that he would remain above suspicion. The second suspect. Despite Canales being taken into custody, suspicions about Philippe were not entirely dispelled. He was armed with identical service weapons, also stood behind the deceased colleague, and could have fired the shot. Moreover, he had previously been disciplined for the unjustified use of a weapon during a criminal arrest, though no one was harmed in that instance. Araya had since been nicknamed the Reckless Shooter. The defense team hired by the relatives to defend Lionel immediately seized this theory, insisting that Philippe accidentally shot the colleague, and since the service weapons were identical, the pistols could have been mixed up or intentionally swapped. Additionally, the man was inconsistent in his testimony, changing it several times, and later he claimed he could not accurately describe the events of that night, as everything happened very quickly. However, no gunpowder residue was found on the driver's hands, indicating his innocence. In response, Camales claimed that gunpowder got on his hands when he was compressing the wound on the victim's body, and Araya, who also helped the woman, might have washed his hands before the examination. Yet this statement was not credible, as Valeria's bloodstains remained on Philippe's hands, and it's impossible to wash off gunpowder without removing blood. The trial and verdict. The quality of the investigative team's work was once again questioned, and the deceased girl's parents despaired, unsure how to achieve justice. Furthermore, the new turn in the case caused public outrage and led to mistrust in the law enforcement agencies. This story was now covered not only by Chilean but also international media. As a result, many high-ranking officials were suspended from work and soon lost their positions, particularly the head of the Homicide Investigation Department. After additional investigation, Lionel remained the only suspect, with all others excluded from the list and classified as witnesses. In the spring of 2022, he was officially dismissed and remained in custody until the trial's conclusion. The hearings for this case only began in March of the following year, and based on the evidence and witness testimony, the suspect's guilt was fully proven. Initially, the prosecution accused Camales of intentionally murdering his partner and sought the maximum sentence for such cases. However, the accused insisted he would never harm Valeria, as he loved her. Nonetheless, it was from his pistol that the bullet was fired, ending the girl's life. Lionel was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 12 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 8 years. Following the announcement of the final verdict, the Vivanco family expressed their disagreement, considering the sentence too lenient, while the defendant and his legal team immediately filed a series of appeals. However, the real shock came to Valeria's relatives in February 2024, when the Supreme Court unexpectedly overturned the previously assigned punishment, sentencing the perpetrator to only 540 days of imprisonment, counted from the day of his arrest. Effectively, he walked free from the courtroom. The detective Valeria Vivanco's family, in light of this event, plans to sue the Chilean state, accusing the judges of corruption. In an official statement, the deceased girl's mother said, "The 12-year sentence already seemed too lenient to us, but this is just mockery. I feel as if my daughter has died all over again. I no longer believe in justice. Our family plans to sue the negligent Chilean state, as that's exactly what it deserves." Monday, September 14, 2015, was remembered by 16-year-old Nolan Buchanan as the best day of his life. The day before, he had spent Sunday with his girlfriend. A traditional morning mass with his girlfriend's family, followed by a get-together with friends and a wonderfully romantic evening. Waking up on Monday morning, next to his favorite girl, the teenager felt like a free, successful, and influential businessman, before whom the whole world is open. After all, he was now the owner of Buchanan Construction. The young man was going to inherit cars, a house, land, monetary assets, and made plans how he would manage the family business alone, and certainly do it better than his father, who brought the company to bankruptcy. It would seem that what could go wrong? Already on October 1st, 2015, Nolan Keith Buchanan was arrested at Bonita High School in Bonita, California, by the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office. Nolan was incarcerated at the Juvenile Treatment Center, JTC, in South Lake Tahoe until June 13, 2018, when an El Dorado County jury of 7 men and 5 women found Buchanan guilty of 3 charges. The jury took just 2 hours to reach a verdict. The young man was sentenced to 150 years in prison with the possibility of parole from the 25th year of his sentence. This is how his plan to take over the family business ended. Neighbors and classmates spoke of Nolan as a model kid and a good student. As far as I know, he was a good kid, Anita high school student Campbell Ruxton would later say in an interview. He always cared about school, he seemed very kind, he was very nice. I'm even surprised he was arrested. But what really happened in the Buchanan family? Let's break down this horrific case in detail. Molly first met Adam Buchanan when she came to apply for a job at his firm as an office manager. By the time they met, Adam was already divorced and raising his son Nolan from a previous marriage on his own. Cheerful, sociable, and cheerful blonde immediately attracted the attention of the owner of the company. The interest was mutual. Molly fell in love, started a romance that turned into a serious relationship, and her move to Adam. Molly dreamed of a real, loving, friendly family and tried to build a wonderful relationship with her stepson. Soon she became pregnant. Gavin was born. People who knew the Buchanans claimed that they were a fairly close-knit family of 4. The head of the family, who owned a construction company, earned enough to ensure a comfortable life, and the family even purchased vacation property in El Dorado County, California. A small cabin sat on 19 acres in Greenwood, a rustic cabin with no electricity, water, sewer, or gas. Adam, who worked in construction, took an active role in remodeling the house, and the family began to visit there often. On September 13, 2015 at 10 a.m., members of the Garden Valley Fire Department responded to a wildfire in Greenwood Township in western El Dorado County on Highway 193 between Cool and Georgetown. Upon arrival, they found the fire had destroyed 10 acres of the property. A cabin located on the property was still smoldering, but had burned to the ground. The fire department personnel observed charred remains in the ashes. The scene of the fire was not touched, and at 11 a.m. firefighters called the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office. No one had yet realized what was at the scene. Firefighters were almost certain that the victim of the wildfire was a pet trapped in the house. The arriving coroner was faced with a daunting task. The remains of the house were still smoldering, and there was no way to examine the inside of the house. They had to wait for the flames to finally die down and for the temperature to drop slightly. As the coroner examined the house, he smelled the sweet odor of burnt flesh and later discovered a human skull and a burned chest. It appeared that the tragedy had claimed someone's life. The officer requested backup. Officers from the sheriff's office arrived and conducted a thorough examination of the scene. The conclusion was obvious. The small, secluded and remote cabin was not the primary residence of its owners. Rather, it was most likely a country cabin where people came to vacation. A Dodge truck and trailer were found on the property adjacent to the cabin. It was possible to run the license plates and find out who the car belonged to. The owner may have been the victim of the wildfire. It didn't take long to find out that the vehicle and trailer belonged to Buchanan Construction, a company owned by a man named Adam Buchanan. The man in question lived 160 miles from the scene of the accident, about 3 hours away in Bonita, California. This information confirmed the assumption of the police, who decided that the house was just a country residence for those who vacation here from the hustle and bustle of the city. It remained to be seen who was inside, Mr. Buchanan himself or someone else. The name of the owner of the company gave the detectives their first clue, with which they began their investigation. The Bonita police officers were tasked with checking to see if all of Buchanan's family members were well and at home. They went to the correct address and were soon in the Buchanan's driveway, where they noticed a white Ford pickup truck. At a knock on the door, Adam's 16-year-old son from his first marriage came out. He greeted the uniformed officers with surprise and asked what brought them to him. The officers decided to first find out who was in the house so as not to frighten the household. Perhaps the company car had been taken by someone from the company and not the owner himself. Nolan Buchanan said his father Adam had gone away for the weekend to his country estate, 160 miles away, with Molly and their 8-year-old son Gavin, and they were due back in the evening. According to him, his father had left him to look after the house. Investigators did not yet have sufficient reason to believe the remains in the cabin were those of the Buchanans, but the information received and the discovery of the remains, believed to be those of 2 people, by the evening of September 13th, was enough to report the family missing in the El Dorado County fire. The next day, September 14th, El Dorado County Police went to Nolan's home to talk to him more thoroughly and try to figure out whose lives the fire had claimed. Officers were met by Adam's parents, Howard and Susan Buchanan. They said that their son, the owner of the burned-out cabin, does his own home repairs and therefore travels there very often. The parents were very concerned as they had not been able to contact their son or daughter-in-law until now. From the story, the officers learned that the house is connected to generators, but at the time of the tragedy, it had no electricity. There were, however, gas cylinders inside. This gave two theories. The fire could have been either accidental or intentional. By September 15th, the fire scene had cooled down and investigators were finally able to collect evidence, including debris from a nearby fire pit. According to Detective James Peterson of the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office, new remains were discovered that changed the direction of the case. Police found a piece of skull with a bullet hole. At that point, we all realized that there was actually a homicide. This was not an accidental fire, reported the sheriff. The remains were collected and sent for forensic DNA testing. In the first set of remains, the bullet was lodged in the victim's thigh. The skull with the bullet hole, judging by its size, belonged to a child. The version of fatal accident dropped by itself. The version of murder came to the forefront. No one now doubted that the fire was a means of destroying the traces of the crime. It remained to find out under what circumstances the crime had taken place. Was it a burglary that had gone wrong? Or had the family taken their lives deliberately? But then by whom and why? Or could the crime be related to Buchanan Construction, a company where Adam Buchanan was president and chief operating officer, and someone harbored a grudge against him due to a working relationship? Initially, investigators focused specifically on the latter theory. They also looked into Molly's life to determine if she had any enemies capable of the crime. Once those lines of inquiry stalled, officers turned their attention to problems in Molly and Adam's marriage. There proved to be plenty of them. Investigators learned that over time, Molly and Adam's relationship began to deteriorate, and at the time of the crime, they had been sleeping apart for quite some time. A diary was found in which Molly described abuse from Adam. Witnesses interviewed described rough treatment and abuse. According to them, Adam was rude not only to Molly, but also to the children. Molly's mother, Susie Slankard, admitted to investigators, "There were times when I was afraid they would kill each other in one of their arguments." Molly did not sever her relationship with Adam, but would periodically take her son and leave to go to her parents' house and return a few days later until the next fight. It also turned out that the couple liked to hunt in the area where their country house was located. Since everyone was armed, the investigators assumed that during another quarrel, one of the spouses grabbed a gun and shot, and when he realized what he had done, he took his own life. However, there was an inconsistency. If the tragedy happened because of a conflict between husband and wife, it means that near the remains of one of them must necessarily be the instrument of crime, which, however, was not. Investigators speculated that the weapon may have been damaged in the fire and may not have looked as obvious as expected. Over the course of 5 days, forensic team members took turns removing ashes from the home. The search was conducted with surgical thoroughness, but did not yield the expected result. No weapons were found in the house. By this time came the data of forensic examination. The examination confirmed that the DNA of the bodies belonged to Adam Buchanan, Molly McAfee, and their 8-year-old son. All 3 victims had suffered gunshot wounds before the fire, and the angle of the bullet wounds ruled out the version that someone took their own life. The lack of firearms meant that someone else was in the house. A 4th person who shot the Buchanans, and the investigation had to start over. Police had no choice but to turn to the 16-year-old son of the deceased. Nolan told officers that the family drove away in an old Dodge truck. According to the son, his father decided to use the company vehicle rather than his personal Ford, which was parked in the driveway, because he had loaded the truck and trailer with rocks that he was going to decorate the area near his country cabin. It was this truck that police found near the burned structure. When asked why Nolan did not go on vacation with his relatives, the young man, as in the first interview, said that he had a duty to look after the house and garden during the absence of his father and stepmother. Nolan also said that they had a neighbor growing forbidden grass on the edge of the Buchanan property, which caused his father to have frequent arguments with this neighbor, demanding that he stop planting the grass and threatening to go to the police. Talking about the family business, Nolan told of the company's financial difficulties. Things were not going well. The company was undergoing downsizing and the number of employees was down to 5. From what his father said, the debts associated with the business were increasing rapidly. So now the investigation had a lot of useful information, and the detectives had a suspect, a neighbor, especially since in that area, violent crime was often linked to the cultivation of illegal herbs. Detectives felt that the threat of going to the police could have led to the murder of Buchanan and his family. The problem was, no one had any idea which neighbor they were talking about. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood, interviewing all the homeowners in a row. The tactic was successful. They found a man who confirmed the story of a quarrel with Adam over growing a forbidden crop. But according to him, after a sharp conversation, the conflict was over. The neighbor had an alibi, and another version turned out to be untenable. What remained to be dealt with was the financial crisis that had hit the family's business. On September 18th, the police visited Adam's company and interviewed the employees. Nolan's words were true. The company was in a sorry state. It was threatened with bankruptcy, as the amount of debts exceeded $30,000. Because of this, some employees were fired. It turned out that some of the former employees were extremely dissatisfied with the reduction and therefore could be involved in the crime. And that's where investigators got lucky. Over the weekend, the local high school organized a community cleanup day. The students were clearing debris from a business park just a mile from Adam's construction company. It was there on September 19th that a small purse with a wallet and identification cards belonging to Molly Nitafe and Adam Buchanan was found under one of the bushes. A .22 caliber rifle was lying nearby. Detectives immediately went to the scene of the discovery. The county sheriff's office made a new assumption. The perpetrator had massacred the Buchanan family with the found rifle and, covering his tracks, had taken their documents from the crime scene. The discovery was important because it meant that someone had traveled all the way to Greenwood to kill the family and then returned to Bonita to dispose of the bag and murder weapon. It appeared to be a Bonita resident. A proximity of the evidence found to the location of Buchanan construction strengthened the theory that the boss was massacred by one of the disgruntled employees. Detectives sent the firearm and the bag of documents for examination, requesting a warrant to inspect the company's records and premises. Here, the investigators got lucky a second time. During the search, they gained access to a video surveillance camera installed on the firm's premises. By happy coincidence, the lens of the camera was directed not at the company's territory, but at the center of the parking lot. After this discovery, the case was just days away from being solved. Since it was already known that the family had gone out of town on Friday, investigators reviewed Friday's footage and were surprised to find that Adam had attached a trailer filled with rocks to a Ford F-150, not a Dodge truck as Nolan had told them. Detectives realized that the young man had deliberately manipulated the investigation. If the white Ford had towed the rock trailer to the cabin, then someone must have driven it back and parked it in the driveway of the Buchanan family home. Investigators re-interviewed Nolan, trying to keep him safe while getting as many details as possible. Nolan again recounted his weekend, where he had been, and who he had seen. Only this time they asked him what movie they had seen at the cinema, how he had paid for the shopping at the mall, and how he had paid for dessert on a date. The unsuspecting Nolan answered, with his father's credit card. The officers then applied for a warrant to search Buchanan's home in Bonita, search the vehicles, and check financial records. The Ford automobile was still parked in the driveway. It was closely inspected, and they noticed reddish soil sticking to the wheels, similar to that in Greenwood. If the Ford had been used for a trip last weekend or earlier, traces of soil might have remained, but they would not have been as obvious. Unfortunately, the fire had destroyed the wheel tread marks near the country house, but the dirt buildup indicated that the car had probably been to Greenwood recently. Detectives tracked the bank card payments and found that Adam Buchanan had used his credit card on Friday, September 11th, at fast food chain Taco Bell on his way to Greenwood. Nolan, on the other hand, claimed he stayed home, did not go with his parents, and had the credit card in his possession. Detectives went to the diner and checked the security cameras. They saw exactly what they expected: a white Ford instead of a truck. When detectives searched the Ford, they found a Taco Bell receipt dated September 11th that included not 3 but 4 drinks. Evidence collected at the scene of the fire similarly pointed to 4 drink cups. So Nolan was in the car? The next credit card transaction took place on Saturday, September 12th, at the Valencia Club bar in Penryn, about 30 minutes away from the cabin. Adam's parents had previously told detectives about the bar. They said their son and daughter-in-law liked to drop in there after renovations to the cabin. Security cameras recorded the time the couple left the bar, and traffic cameras on the highway helped track the couple's route. A Ford F-150 headed toward the Buchanan cabin around 2:30 a.m. on the day of the fire, and at 3:30 a.m. drove in the opposite direction. In the first instance, the camera captured Adam and Molly in the vehicle, and in the second, only Nolan. A few hours later, on Sunday morning, September 13th, Adam's credit card was used to pay at 3 of Benita's establishments: Starbucks, McDonald's, and a gas station. The bank confirmed to investigators that Buchanan had only one bank card. The facts contradicted Nolan's stories. By this time, forensic results had come back. Nolan's fingerprints were found on the gun. He was arrested right in the middle of a high school class. Nolan Buchanan pleaded not guilty to the charges against him. He attempted to distort the story and claimed that it was his father who shot the family, after which he pointed a rifle at him, and he, defending himself, took the weapon away, accidentally shooting his father. Nolan insisted it was self-defense, attributing the fire and subsequent lie to a state of panic and extreme fright. That's why he took gasoline and set the house on fire to make it look like nothing had happened there. The defense continually focused the jury's attention on Adam's abuse of his own son and other family members. The medical examiner questioned the verdict because the bullet wound mark on a piece of Gavin's skull was consistent with a shot fired at nearly a 90-degree angle. Nolan, on the other hand, claimed that his and his brother's beds were next to each other, and they were simultaneously awakened by the noise and screaming. It was at the moment of awakening that Nolan allegedly saw someone enter the bedroom and shoot Gavin. The shooter then pointed the rifle at him, and Nolan miraculously managed to push the attacker away. Under this scenario, the shot would have been fired at about a 45-degree angle, which was inconsistent with forensic evidence. The prosecution came to believe that Nolan shot his brother when they were alone in the house while their parents spent time at a bar. After waiting for his father and stepmother to return, Nolan shot them as well. Judging by where the bodies were found, Adam was killed first, followed by Molly. Nolan then took the rifle, his parents' papers, doused the bodies with gasoline, and set the house on fire. Then he went home, met his girlfriend, and spent the day with her, creating an alibi for himself. On July 13, 2018, a jury found Nolan guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. As a result, he was sentenced to 150 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Judge Kingsbury, in announcing the sentence, reflected on the verbal and physical abuse Nolan faced, on the testimony that Nolan massacred his brother because he didn't want him to go through the same horror or be forced to live with what his father had already managed to do to him. But as she did, she also listed facts about the premeditation of the crime and subsequent arson, the creation of alibis, and the plans to run the family business that Nolan had voiced to family members. The judge cited a failure to follow rules and deviant behavior noted by staff at the South Lake Tahoe Juvenile Treatment Center, where Nolan went after his arrest. "Everyone has the opportunity to change," Judge Kingsbury told Nolan. "I hope you will do everything in your power to do so. If you behave well, you will have a chance to get out on parole in 25 years under the Senate bill and Supreme Court rulings. It's up to you whether you take that chance or not." Nolan continues to insist he is innocent. If he ever gets out on parole, he will have to pay a huge compensation to the victims. The amount of the payout is unknown at this time. The tragic story of the Rose family is considered one of the most bizarre and confusing crimes committed in America in recent years. This case struck investigators not only by its cynicism and cruelty, but also by the fact that the victims and the alleged perpetrators were close relatives. Despite the fact that many years have passed since the crime was committed, and the perpetrator has long served his harsh sentence behind bars, there are still many questions and white spots in this story. Many still do not believe in the fairness of the court's verdict. Now let's get down to business. It was an ordinary average family living in a provincial suburb of Bristol in the state of Tennessee and had never been on the radar of law enforcers before. The family was headed by elderly couple Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, who had lived together for over 40 years. They had 2 grown daughters and 6 grandchildren, but we will only look at those family members who were directly involved in this high-profile case. So, at the time of the crime, in the house and the surrounding area were the elderly owners themselves, Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, their eldest daughter, 39-year-old Tosha Milhorn with her husband James, and 6 children. 2 of the children were Tosha and James's shared children, while the other 3 children were their heirs from a previous relationship. Also present in the house was a neighborhood girl who stopped by to play with them. It is worth noting that Tosha and James and their children lived at Tosha's parents' house for about 2 months, as their own home was undergoing renovations at the time. Later, another key player in those events, 19-year-old Seth Denton, arrived at the house. He was Toshi's eldest son, but his relationship with his mother and stepfather was strained, to put it mildly, and they avoided communicating with each other in every possible way, and their last meeting ended in tragedy. According to neighbors, the Rose couple was quite happy and prosperous. Their daughter Tosha was also happily married to James, who worked as an auto mechanic and was fond of restoring vintage cars. It was the Rose couple's family home that was the scene of the carnage. Police officers who arrived on the call later dubbed it the worst crime scene they had ever seen and the bloodiest in the history of their quiet county. The bodies of 2 women, Lena Maria and Tosha, a mother and daughter, were found in the house, shot almost point blank. Tosha was in a chair at the dining room table, and her mother was lying on the floor between the table and the refrigerator. Also lying on the doorstep of the house was the critically wounded James, Tosha's husband, who was quickly rushed to the hospital, but despite the efforts of the doctors, the man soon died of extensive internal injuries and massive blood loss. None of the children in the house were injured. It is likely that they were not targeted by the shooter, or were simply not in his field of vision at the time of the massacre of the adults. Almost immediately after the crime, the police received 2 phone calls, one after the other. The first call came from the owner of the house, Curtis Rose, who said that his eldest grandson Seth had committed a shooting in the house and then fled the scene. But soon there was a call from Seth himself, who told a different version of what happened and blamed everything on his grandfather Curtis. In addition, it turned out that Seth was wounded in the arm and shot him Curtis. However, he did not deny it, saying that he was trying to detain his grandson and not let him escape from the scene of the massacre. The alleged killer, Seth Denton, was arrested in the hospital, where he sought medical help in connection with the wound. Then the investigation was to restore the chain of tragic events and find out what really happened in the house of the Rose family. Surprisingly, but for the basis of the investigation was taken only one version, and the second version was taken seriously only a few years later. On August 29, 2015, around 6 o'clock in the evening, residents of houses located near the scene of the crime heard a series of gunshots. No one paid much attention to it, as there were forests around, where hunting of wild animals and birds was allowed. Later, one of the neighbors noted that he was a little alarmed by the number of shots, and then the silence, but he did not consider it a good reason to call the police. Another neighbor testified at trial that in addition to the gunshots, he heard screaming and went out on the porch of his house to see what was going on. At that point, he saw a young man running down the path from the neighbor's house to a car parked by the road. He was being chased by another man, but because of the trees by the road, the witness had a poor view of what was happening. He only saw the guy jump into the vehicle, then 2 shots rang out, and then the car sped off. Just a few minutes later, neighbors heard the howling of sirens and saw police cars and emergency vehicles starting to arrive at Rose's house, and soon an air ambulance helicopter landed on the lawn outside the house, arriving to pick up James, who was still alive. Everything that was happening resembled the shooting of some movie, and none of the eyewitnesses did not understand what happened. Arriving police officers were met by the elderly owner of the house, who was holding a firearm, and another gun belonging to him was later found in his bedroom. Curtis told his version of events, which was taken as the basis of the investigation and was long believed to be the only one. According to Curtis, there was nothing to portend trouble that day. In his and his wife's house visited his daughter with his son-in-law and grandchildren, as well as a neighbor's child who came to play. He himself was tinkering in his trailer in the backyard of the house. He heard the sounds of gunshots, but like most neighbors, he didn't pay much attention to it, thinking it was hunters in the woods. Suddenly, his oldest grandson, Seth, appeared at the trailer, arriving unannounced and looking very excited. The young man said there had been some kind of tragedy and asked him to call emergency services immediately. Curtis followed his grandson into the house, where he immediately came across the dead bodies of his wife and daughter. Curtis immediately thought of the children in the house. They were in the other room, frightened, but none of them were hurt. He took them to the back of the house and locked them up so they wouldn't see the horror that was going on in the house. While Curtis was calling emergency services, he saw his grandson hurriedly leaving the house and running toward the road. The homeowner drew his gun and began to chase Seth, believing that he was the killer. As Seth jumped into the car, Grandpa fired 2 shots. One bullet shattered the rear window without hitting the driver, and the second bullet hit Seth in the left shoulder. Despite the injury, he managed to get away, but after reaching the nearest house, Seth stopped to call the police and report what had happened. The local sheriff who was investigating was puzzled. The picture of the crime looked so strange and illogical that similar cases simply did not exist in his memory. In a breaking news report, he said that the investigators had a difficult job ahead of them to reconstruct the whole picture of the crime. After the arrest of Seth Denton, it was necessary to establish the motive why the young man had treated his family members so cruelly, and most surprisingly, such a motive was quickly found. Seth was the eldest child of his mother Toshi, whom she had given birth to in her early youth. Her relationship with the boy's father did not work out, and her son's upbringing was mostly handled by his grandparents, while the young woman settled her personal life. Also, according to some reports, Tosha suffered from bipolar affective disorder and periodically went to the clinic. Most likely, her son could also inherit this disease. Since childhood, the boy had a strong resentment towards his mother, whom he hardly ever saw. With age, this feeling turned into hatred, about which Seth often told friends and relatives. After graduating from school, the guy decided to go to serve in the army, and a year later, returning home, he again settled at his grandparents'. However, soon the young man decided that he wanted to start an independent life and moved to the city, where he rented a small apartment with his friend. He got a job at one of the local fast food restaurants, but shortly before the tragedy, the guy was fired. Family and friends spoke positively about Seth, noting that he never had any violent tendencies, did not run with bad companies, and never broke the law. But despite the positive characteristics, detectives considered that the main motive of the crime was Seth's unpleasant feelings towards his mother and her current spouse. According to the investigation, the events of that day developed as follows. Around 5 p.m., Seth drove his car to the house of his grandparents. He was wearing a camouflage jacket, and in the car lay a semi-automatic rifle. He left the car by the roadside, and with the weapon in hand, he went to the house, entering through the back door. Seth then fired several shots, killing his mother, grandmother, and severely wounding his stepfather, before leaving the jacket and rifle by the back door and going to his grandfather's house and asking him to call the police. The order in which the shots were fired was never determined because Seth completely denied his guilt. In addition, it was unclear why he asked his grandfather to call the police rather than fleeing immediately from the scene of the crime. It is assumed that his main target were his mother and stepfather, and the guy killed his grandmother as an unnecessary witness. As the main evidence proving Seth's guilt, the case included his jacket and rifle, found on the threshold at the back door of the house, traces of blood on his shoes, as well as bullets found in his car. Remarkably, about 100 rounds of ammunition in total were found, but no one questioned why he needed so many if he only planned to kill 2 people. Another oddity was the timing. According to the grandfather, after he and his grandson entered the house, where the terrible picture opened before his eyes, Seth hurriedly left the scene. Curtis himself found and took the children to safety, called the police, pulled out the gun he kept, and after all this, managed to catch up with his grandson and shot him twice. It was not until 2016 that the young man presented his version of what happened in court, which no one had previously considered for some reason. According to Seth, he has always been very close to his grandparents who raised him, but meetings with his mother he avoided by all means. As a teenager, he often went to shooting ranges with his grandfather, and it was his grandfather who encouraged him to join the army. On that fateful day, Seth called his maternal aunt Amanda, his mother's younger sister, and said he was going to visit his grandparents but didn't want to meet his mother there. The woman did not know that Tosha and her husband were visiting her parents, so she assured Seth that he could go without fear of crossing paths with his mother and stepfather. Amanda confirmed that information in court, noting that her nephew couldn't have known that Tosha and James were at Rose's house. Seth had hoped that he and his grandfather would go to the shooting range, and that was the reason he had brought a rifle with so many rounds of ammunition. He drove up to the house, got the gun, and went straight to the trailer where Grandpa usually worked. There, his grandson showed him his rifle, and they had a little discussion about it. Curtis then headed for the house without letting go of the rifle, and his grandson followed him. Seth knew that his grandfather had a gun and expected him to follow him, and afterward they would shoot targets together. However, when Curtis entered the room, he immediately opened fire, and the people in the room did not even have time to realize anything and did not try to run away or hide. According to Seth's lawyers, Curtis may have had a temporary insanity during which he killed members of his family. But this version seemed untenable, so it was not considered initially and marked in court, although on the clothes and shoes of an elderly man also had traces of blood of the victims. He, for some reason from the very beginning, was not even included in the number of suspects. The young man in the dock was facing the capital punishment of death for the premeditated triple murder of his family members. His grandfather had been a key witness in the case from the beginning, and despite the fact that he had openly stated that he was prepared to kill his grandson that day, the court found such behavior justified. Curtis Rose was not taken to the station or questioned as a suspect, and his version of the events of that day was accepted as the only true one. In addition, many details and inconsistencies were simply overlooked, and Seth's version was not even considered until a year and a half after the crime. Most of the physical evidence did confirm Curtis's words, but what was out of the picture was somehow ignored by the investigation. The main argument in court was that Mr. Rose had no obvious motive for killing his wife, daughter, and son-in-law. The version of temporary insanity seemed far-fetched and untenable. The trial lasted more than a week, during which time nearly 200 pieces of evidence were presented and dozens of witnesses, including neighbors, relatives, and family friends, were heard. The grandfather and grandson's testimony completely contradicted each other, and it was obvious that one of them was lying. The jury deliberated for several days. They admitted to being severely exhausted emotionally and physically, but when it came to a verdict, they unanimously stated that they had no doubt that the defendant was guilty of each of the counts charged. Thus, Seth Denton was found guilty of triple murder, but after a detailed review of all the evidence and circumstances of the tragedy, the court decided to exclude the death penalty from the possible punishments, changing the sentence to life imprisonment without the right to parole, at least the next 50 years. The convict himself never admitted his guilt. He is currently serving his sentence in a Tennessee prison. As for the orphaned children of Tosha and James Milhorn, they were left in the care of other family members, including their Aunt Amanda and grandfather Curtis. Beauty and the Beast. Perhaps only in movies can women be assassins or hired soldiers. In real life, 8 out of 10 criminals are men, according to statistics. If women do commit violent acts, they usually do so as accomplices or instigators. Alongside the elderly, disabled, and minors, women often appear as victims. They differ from men not only physiologically, but also psychologically. The behavior of the male half of humanity is aggressive and provocative, unlike that of women. Women are more gentle, emotional. They enter a state of hypnosis more easily, are more quickly and strongly affected by anesthetics and psychoactive substances, are more prone to depression, and are more susceptible to deceit and manipulation. A woman is always guided by love, compassion, creation. However, their aspirations are not always shared by the partners they choose for life. This leads to a confrontation of two principles, often destructive for the weaker party in the relationship. Whenever something extraordinary happens, such as a disappearance or a crime against life, the entire city or even the country empathetically follows the developments, especially if the crime is publicized and the potential criminal shows no remorse for their actions. This is a story about another mysterious crime against a young woman that shook Orange Beach, Alabama, USA, on the calendar May 19, 2016. The police chief informed Gary Bardwell, the father of the missing Jesse, of the long-awaited news. "I'm sorry, sir," he began. "Today will be a difficult day for your family. Unfortunately, we do not expect to find your daughter alive, but we know where she might be." A team of detectives along with FBI agents set out for a remote ranch in Farmersville, North Texas. The group arrived in the evening and immediately went searching. In the wooded area, law enforcement officers stumbled upon a piece of metal covering something. There was an unbearable smell of decay nearby. However, those who arrived were prepared not only for this, but also for what caused it. Indeed, on the other side of the shield lay a female body, wrapped in a blue sheet. The corpse was covered with a blanket and 2 red-gold towels with bloodstains. A pile of trash mixed with dirt became the improvised gravestone for the unfortunate. It was clear that the perpetrator was an amateur, as trying to hide the result of their actions, they made it more noticeable. The condition of the body was terrible. After a week under the scorching sun, it had significantly decomposed. Experts needed 7 days to officially identify the victim. For this, dental records of the presumed victim were requested. As the investigation suspected, the discovered body belonged to 27-year-old Jesse Bardwell. The examination showed that the young woman's death was the result of a crime. However, the exact cause could not be determined as the body was too decomposed. Notably, an unknown informant pointed to the location of the woman's remains. Their name was not disclosed until the end. Jesse Bardwell, a beloved daughter and friend, seemingly vanished from the home she shared with her boyfriend named Jason Lowe. Sensing trouble, Gary set off from Mississippi to Texas in search of his child. His instincts were correct. His girl had indeed been in danger for quite some time. But let's start from the beginning. It must be said that the father-daughter relationship was exceptionally strong. Gary recalled being deeply moved at the moment of Jesse's birth. She was so fragile and vulnerable that his heart melted and never belonged to him again. Jessie was born on September 10, 1988, in Pascagoula, Mississippi. Gary and Carla Bardwell were wonderful parents, and besides their daughter, they raised a son named Brandon. The siblings got along well, with the older brother always protecting his little sister from bullies. Grandma Kitty, who adored her grandchildren, was a frequent visitor. She read books to them, shared life stories, and invented various games. In short, they were the quintessential American family. Jessie herself was a joyful, cheerful, and kind girl. She had a unique style that set her apart from her friends. She dreamed of making it in the beauty industry and opening her own salon. When Jessie was 14, the family unit broke down. The Bardwells divorced. When it came time to choose whom to live with, the girl chose her father. Their relationship was warm and trusting. Gary worked as a firefighter, so Jessie often called him to check on him and ensure everything was fine. Over time, the man remarried. However, the stepdaughter and stepmother got along well. Gina was an excellent homemaker and took care of everyone in the household. Jesse understood that her father was happy and not alone with such a woman by his side, which was very important to her since she would eventually leave the nest. After finishing school, Jessie decided to become independent, so she moved to Orange Beach, Alabama. To support herself, she worked as a waitress at the popular beachfront restaurant Cobalt. Gary remembered how she loved being near the water. It calmed her. Father and daughter kept in constant touch, exchanging messages. When he visited, they would go boating and fishing. Kimberly Esbury, the restaurant manager and Jessie's friend, learned that Jessie's father was a talented musician. Upon retiring, he devoted more time to his passion, honing his skills. As a result, he was often invited to perform at the establishment and even had his own table there. Kimberly later admitted to admiring the relationship between Jessie and her father. They were true friends. Jessie was always present at his performances. The tips she earned went towards college and her dream. At work, she met a young man named Terry Ellis, also a waiter. They started dating after some time. Their relationship was steady and serious. They seemed like a harmonious couple. However, at one of the social events, Jessie was taken by his friend Jason Lowe. Her sudden infatuation surprised everyone. It seemed she was head over heels in love with him, oblivious to everything else around her. After explaining her sudden feelings, Jessie and Terry parted as amicably as they had met. Nonetheless, this decision turned her life upside down by 360 degrees. The new boyfriend was undoubtedly handsome and promising. He had 2 degrees and a decent job. Jason knew how to present himself and was polite. However, for Jessie, the new feelings were also a ticket to a new life. When he heard about his beloved's dreams, he promised to fulfill them. Eventually, the young man needed to transfer to Dallas, Texas. Then, Jessie followed him. The new position in the technology industry promised Jason a high-paying job. Kimberly shared that Jessie saw the move more as an adventure than something that could fundamentally change her life. She certainly didn't want to part with her father for long and hesitated for a while. However, ambition and youthful idealism prevailed. She did all this in secret from Gary. She was very afraid of disappointing her father, knowing he would be against it. Therefore, she didn't tell him even when they spent their last Christmas together. Mr. Bardwell noticed nothing unusual in his daughter's behavior. She was as happy as usual, laughing and joking. So, the 24-year-old found herself in Richardson, a suburb of Dallas. Jason worked from home, while Jessie searched for a new job and scouted locations for her salon. The couple planned to marry and buy a house. However, Jessie's relationship with her father underwent a drastic change. They grew distant. The daughter stopped answering his calls. Mr. Bardwell was troubled by this uncharacteristic behavior. After speaking with Kimberly, he learned about Jessie's new boyfriend and her move to another state. Ultimately, the man accepted the news and tried to re-establish contact. That's when he discovered that Jason controlled all communications. The only way to speak with Jessie was to call her boyfriend or the home phone. After each attempt, Jason would say she'd call back. Eventually, Jessie did indeed get in touch with her father. Months later, Gary finally met the suspicious young man in person when the couple visited Pascagoula. The father tried to convince his daughter not to return to Texas. He had a strong dislike for Lowe. That time, Jessie hugged him tighter than usual. When Gary asked if everything was okay, she said it was fine. She expressed her desire to make them proud, hence her need to leave. Persuading Jessie otherwise was impossible. Despite never showing signs of distress, her father had a bad feeling. After meeting with her, he wrote a song titled "Taken," dedicated to his daughter. 4 months after moving to Texas, she stopped responding to calls altogether. The final straw came on May 8th, when she failed to wish her mother and stepmother a happy Mother's Day, uncharacteristic of her. Gary sensed something terrible had happened, especially since she missed such a cherished family holiday. He called Jason, who claimed he didn't know Jessie's whereabouts. The boyfriend mentioned they were in an open relationship, allowing her to come and go as she pleased. Gary knew this to be false. Jason contradicted himself. He was very jealous and controlled every move. The next morning, the father headed to Texas, convinced of the boyfriend's involvement in his daughter's disappearance. En route, he messaged Lowe, "If Jesse isn't home when I arrive, you're in big trouble." Upon reaching their apartment, he found no trace of his daughter or her belongings. Yet, the boyfriend persisted he was unaware of her location and awaited her return. Later, Kimberly shared details Jesse confided during their rare heart-to-heart conversations. Apparently, Jason squandered money on prohibited substances and entertainment. His promises to fulfill the girl's dream evaporated. Largely, the boyfriend pretended to be someone he wasn't. This extended to his treatment of Jesse. Publicly, their relationship appeared one way, but in private, Jason could be rude and aggressive, leading to frequent conflicts between them. With Jesse missing from the house, Gary filed a missing person report with the Richardson police. Detective Hiram Hale, a father of 3 daughters, led the investigation into her disappearance. The man was determined to uncover the truth. Law enforcement officials acted immediately. They spoke with Lowe several times and inspected the house, but found no trace of the missing woman. During the conversation, the young man mentioned that he last saw her on May 8th around 10 a.m., leaving without explanation, possibly to visit her parents. He saw her get into her Acura car and drive away. Jason kept insisting that despite strong feelings, their relationship was non-committal. He claimed he didn't control her or pry into her personal life. However, investigators received information contradicting his statements. It turned out Jesse had sold her car 3 weeks earlier, a fact he surely knew since he was present at the sale. This raised questions for the investigators, prompting them to interrogate him again. On May 12th, during a subsequent search of his home, police found a strip of powder on a plate in the kitchen. The substance turned out to be cocaine. The investigation then focused on Lowe's garage and the vehicle inside it. Initially resistant, citing the garage was shared and needed others' permission for a search, Lowe eventually ceased his objections. Upon entering, officers immediately noticed a smell characteristic of crime. Jason Lowe's Audi was mud-splattered, and its bumper was detached. Police suspected that Jesse Bardwell might be inside the car. Although the vehicle was empty, the smell of decomposition intensified. Inside, they found the broken bumper and what appeared to be bloodstains in the trunk. When experts sprayed a luminol-based substance, the cargo area lit up with blue light. Blood, presumably belonging to the missing woman. Jason explained he got stuck in the mud while searching for his girlfriend, catching the bumper on a bush. He remained adamant about not knowing her whereabouts. He could not explain the blood in the car or the presence of controlled substances in his home. Experts concluded the amount of blood in the trunk indicated the woman was deceased. Given the circumstances, the case was reclassified as a homicide. To prevent the main suspect from fleeing, he was detained on charges related to the narcotic substances. During interrogation, Lowe persisted in his narrative. When shown a photo of his loved one, he refused to provide explanations, looking emotionlessly at the picture and suggesting he was being framed for something he didn't do. Eventually, despite the absence of a body, the suspect was charged with homicide. As the search for the young woman continued, a challenging and lengthy process in the vastness of Texas, with its many rivers, lakes, fields, and forests, where a body could easily be concealed, her family, friends, and sympathetic acquaintances held a memorial service. The event took place on the beach by the water Jesse loved. Everyone prayed for her to be found and for justice for her suffering. Their prayers were answered on May 19th when Jessica Bardwell was found deceased. Her loved ones at least had the chance to mourn her and say goodbye. Gary felt it necessary to review his daughter's autopsy report. He was appalled that his girl, wrapped in a sheet and barely recognizable as a human, was discarded like trash. Her body was returned to her hometown thanks to Gary's friends. Former colleagues hired and loaded Jesse into a funeral hearse. About 1,000 people visited the First United Methodist Church to pay their respects to the victim. Kitty Bardwell, Jesse's grandmother, confessed, "If this town could be cleansed with the tears shed for Jesse, it would truly be clean." The tragedy that struck their family garnered widespread attention, with many expressing sincere condolences for their premature loss, coming forward to support the Bardwells. A year had passed. Gary sat in McKinney Jail in Texas, still reluctantly cooperating with the investigation. However, 2 facts regarding Jesse's case were eventually extracted from him. Firstly, he claimed what happened to her was an accident, planning to reveal the details in court, hoping for the jury's understanding. This made it challenging for the prosecution to build their case during the trial, much to the delight of Andy Farkas, Lowe's attorney. Farkas staged a mock trial with outsiders acting as jurors. Based on the available evidence and Jason's confession, the mock trial regarding Jessica's case fell apart. 15 pseudo-jurors decided to acquit Lowe. Farkas hoped that knowing the truth, a real court would also deliver a not guilty verdict. Remember the anonymous tip about the victim's body location? It turned out that information came from Jason himself. This became another piece of evidence obtained during the investigation. The prosecution offered a deal to reduce his sentence by half if he disclosed Jesse's location. After deliberation and consultation with his lawyer, he agreed, requesting that the source of the information remain confidential until the trial. The deal was motivated by law enforcement's desire to allow Jesse's family to say goodbye and bury her body humanely. As time went on, the grief-stricken father longed for justice. To quell his raging fury, he once decided to take a unique approach. Gary printed a photo of Jason, placed it on a stump, and pounded it with a 12-pound sledgehammer. This form of psychological therapy offered him some, albeit small, relief. Mr. Bardwell confessed to struggling to get out of bed in the mornings, living with the hope that Lowe would soon face trial and be convicted for the murder of his only daughter. He blamed himself for what happened, regretting not convincing his daughter to stay or at least break up with her controlling boyfriend. Jesse once called her father, admitting he was right after arguing with Jason, who had kicked her out. She was sheltered by a new friend, but returned to her boyfriend the next day, giving him another chance. Gary had no choice but to accept his daughter's decision, a choice he would deeply regret later. When the trial finally began, Mr. Bardwell arrived in Texas, determined to achieve just punishment. Prosecutor Cynthia Walker began her opening statement by characterizing Jason. Most viewed him as a complex personality with few friends, mostly avoided due to his long history with controlled substances, often leading to uncontrollable rage. Perhaps Jesse was caught in one of these moments. Prosecutor Wes Wynn called Lowe's former girlfriends as witnesses. They confirmed the prosecution's claims about his aggression, sharing fears for their lives due to his jealousy-driven violence. Like with Jesse, he isolated them from family and friends, displaying clear manipulative and pathological lying traits. Hence, each ended their relationship, which was no easy feat, requiring caution and cunning. Conversely, Lowe showcased his superiority among men, effectively pulling the wool over people's eyes. Jason quickly responded to these court revelations. He disclosed starting substance use at 13, influenced by friends, leading to addiction. Nevertheless, he strived to not lose his way in life, achieving multiple degrees and working for a renowned global company. Lowe confessed his desire to fulfill Jesse's dream out of love, aiming to build a family with her. In contrast, the prosecution painted a picture of a man far from someone who had recently lost his beloved, and here's why. The investigation determined that the young woman's demise occurred between May 1st and May 3rd, presumably on the day when the Jordans, the couple's neighbors, last saw her alive. Following an argument that led to Jesse's demise, Jason moved her body to the garage and placed it in the trunk of his car, where it remained for several days. The blood traces found in the Audi indeed belonged to Jesse. He later transported her body to a remote farm and concealed it in the nearby woods. It was established that the sheet wrapping the body was part of Lode's bedding set, which was still found in his home. Fearlessly using it even after Jessie's death, while her body was decomposing in the car, the accused continued to see other women. His phone was filled with corroborative messages and intimate photos, which he sent to these women before meeting them at his apartment. Jason explained that he was trying to distract himself and forget, often indulging in substance use, claiming it made dealing with reality easier. The investigation learned of Jason's presence at Jessie's time of death through a clever manipulation. As the suspect had long denied involvement, detectives asked Tommy Jordan, an acquaintance, to speak with Jason. During their monitored conversation, Lowe admitted he messed up and made a mistake, confessing to an unfortunate accident with Jessie and his guilt, albeit for criminal negligence. Law enforcement took this as a confession. Realizing the investigation was on to him, Jason struck a deal with the prosecution and disclosed the body's location. At the trial, he finally shared his version of events. That evening, he and Jessie took pills that enhanced libido and then became intimate in the shower. At one point, Jason slipped, followed by Jessie, who hit her head on the porcelain bathtub. She then sat down, complaining of feeling hot and dizzy. Jason claimed he offered to call an ambulance, but Jessie refused, suggesting rest and sleep would suffice. However, he found her unconscious the next morning, lying on his chest without breathing. Despite his attempts to revive her, Jessie was dead. Fearing being accused of homicide, he hesitated to call the police and decided to act on his own, initially leaving the body in his car. Days later, he resolved to hide the body on a remote farm, where he carelessly disposed of his former lover in a pile of trash without a proper burial. His story might have been believable if not for the defendant's character and the forensic medical examination findings. The woman had suffered cranial injuries, which couldn't have resulted from slaps to the face, indicating Jason attempted to conceal evidence of a beating. Thus, his entire narrative was fabricated. After a 6-hour deliberation, the jury found him guilty. Judge Scott Becker sentenced the criminal to 50 years in prison. The term could have been longer, up to 99 years, but was reduced due to Jason's deal with the prosecution as agreed. Lowe won't be eligible for parole until at least 2041. At the verdict announcement, Gary was relieved justice prevailed, yet he saw no remorse in the young man's eyes. Standing with the victim's father were Jason's ex-girlfriends. One, Chrissy Chambers, remarked that if she could say anything to Jessie, it would be, "Run, just save yourself." To this day, the convicted Lowe denies his guilt in the homicide, insisting it was an accident. The love of his life decayed in his car while he continued to live and entertain himself. Tragically, Jessie Bardwell saw the dark side of Jason Lowe too late. Daddy's girl hadn't realized how deceitful and brutal men could be, having always had a model of male integrity and care in her father Gary. Regrettably, scoundrels possess a peculiar charm, easily lying or embellishing to intrigue or enamor. This story is a cautionary tale that a woman must choose herself, her safety, and her freedom always and regardless. Otherwise, the story's end can be tragic not just for her but for her entire family. On December 20th, 2017, a press conference was held during which Mark Perez, special agent in charge of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, announced a breakthrough in the disappearance of Mike Williams, a Tallahassee real estate appraiser who was originally presumed to have drowned while duck hunting on Lake Seminole on December 16, 2000, and was eaten by alligators. "Being here now, I can tell you what happened to Mike Williams," Perez said. Mike Williams did not drown in the lake. He wasn't eaten by alligators. He didn't leave town and leave his wife and 18-month-old daughter behind. He was murdered. In the interest of the investigation, we cannot yet release details, but I am happy to report that this morning investigators notified the Williams family of recent discoveries in the case. Today's story is not only about love, betrayal, infidelity, and greed, but also about a mother's resilience. For 17 years and 4 days, Cheryl Williams, Mike's mom, disagreed that her son had drowned in Lake Seminole, and pushed with tenacity for law enforcement to investigate her son's disappearance. She believed with all her heart that those responsible would be punished, believed even when no one else did. I had two choices. He was alive or dead. I chose to believe he was alive, and I really think that's what helped me, Cheryl said on December 20th, 2017. A lot of people called me crazy, but if I had given up, we never would have found him. The day before the press conference, Brian Winchester, a close friend of Mike and his wife Denise, who later married Brian, was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Mike's mother was right. Retribution came to those responsible, and ironically, they were the cause of the truth coming out. In 2000, Brian and Denise's affair, which began in 1997, turned into a murder. And years later, they went from lovers to strangers who didn't trust each other. Brian was very afraid that after the divorce, Denise would inform the police about what had happened to Mike, so he attacked her. Denise, on the other hand, went to great lengths to get him a life sentence. She was very persuasive in asking the jury for the maximum sentence, and it was these efforts that led to Brian having nothing to lose, and he made a deal with the prosecutor. Brian was sentenced to 20 years in 2017 for the kidnapping of Denise Williams, but he avoided a life sentence. Denise was celebrating the victory and was unaware that the conviction was part of a deal in which Brian Winchester, 49, admitted to planning the murder and a 17-year cover-up of the murder and received immunity from any prosecution for his role in the case. In exchange, he led investigators to Mike's body and gave a full and truthful confession. It would only be a few months later, and on May 8, 2018, Denise Williams would be arrested. At first glance, things are a little confusing, aren't they? Let's break down this case in detail. Jerry Michael Williams was born on October 16, 1969, in Bradfordville, north of Tallahassee, the son of a bus driver and a kindergarten teacher. Family and friends called him Mike. Even though the family didn't have much money, and the boy, along with his older brother, grew up living in a trailer, those were happy times. The parents cared about their son's future, and instead of building a house, they set aside money for the education of both boys, who themselves worked part-time at night in supermarkets. The sons enrolled in North Florida Christian High School. There, Mike excelled. He became student council president, played soccer, and was active in the Key Club. At the age of 15, Mike started duck hunting as a hobby and met Denise Merrill. The young lad was a soccer player and student council president. Denise was a cheerleader and council secretary, and they began dating. Friends thought they were a great couple. While still in high school, Mike became best friends with Brian Winchester, whom Denise introduced him to. Brian later had a friend, Katie Thomas, and the two couples remained friends for the rest of Mike's life. After high school, Mike attended Florida State University, where he majored in political science and urban planning. The lovers graduated together. Denise became a public accountant. Mike became a real estate appraiser. Mike proved to be a valuable worker. He often worked 15 hours a day, and of course his career took off. In 1994, the young, successful man married Denise. It was around this time that Brian married Kathy as well. All four of them continued to stay in close contact. Mike loved his wife dearly, strived to provide for their family as best he could, and had incredible energy. At the age of 31, Mike Williams achieved considerable success. As a real estate appraiser, he was earning nearly $200,000 a year. The couple was able to afford a home in a small, upscale neighborhood on the east side of town, and in 1999 became happy parents. They had a daughter, whom the couple named Ansley. Mike's friends told me that he was always prudent. Since the young man was engaged in quite risky activities, he wanted to be sure that in case of disaster, his family would definitely be taken care of. Not surprisingly, Mike turned to his best friend, who was working as an insurance agent at the time. Ryan sold him 2 insurance policies for $250,000 and later for $500,000. In 2000, Mike's father passed away. Williams was so stunned by this suddenness that, wanting to financially secure his own family, he again turned to a friend. Brian helped Mike to insure his life for $1 million. Thus, about 6 months before his disappearance, the life of the loving father of the family was insured for almost $2 million. According to Denise, on the morning of December 16, 2000, her husband woke up early to go duck hunting on Lake Seminole, a large reservoir connected to the Apalachicola River. It was the day of their 6th wedding anniversary, and the couple planned to celebrate the date at night in Apalachicola, a small town on the bayou. The wife and daughter waited for Mike at home at noon, but he never returned. Naturally, Denise became concerned and called her father, who in turn called Mike's best friend, Brian Winchester. Together with his father, Brian drove to Lake Seminole. There they found Mike's Ford Bronco car near the boat dock. But Mike himself was nowhere to be found. The men went around to all the places Mike liked to hunt, but couldn't even find the boat. So they decided to call the police. After investigators from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Agency were called, the search for Mike began. A few hours later, the helicopter pilot found the boat drifting about 225 feet from the boat ramp. The search of the boat turned up Mike's shotgun, still in its case. Apparently, he never got to use it. The search became a rescue operation. Locals believed that before the 3 rivers were dammed to form the lake, the reservoir was the site of an orchard. Thus, the lake got its name Stump Field, due to the many remaining stumps that protruded above and below the water level, requiring careful handling of any motorized boat in the area. Because of this, searchers speculated that Williams hit a stump on his boat, fell out, and submerged himself in the water. His wading boots filled with water, and he probably drowned when he couldn't get out. Several other agencies were called in to help, including a dive team from Montgomery, Alabama, and the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. But the extensive and methodical search yielded nothing. Mike was never located. A week passed and the rescue operation turned into a body search operation. Teams were given probe holes to probe the bottom of the lake, and dogs were brought to the site. 10 days into the search, volunteers found a camouflage-patterned hunting hat that could not be linked to Williams. Officials with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Agency speculated that Mike had been eaten by alligators, which is why the body could not be found. There were actually quite a few alligators living in the lake. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement found no signs indicating a violent death and agreed with that theory. After 5 weeks, the search was called off. The day after the search was called off, Denise held a memorial service for Mike, less than 2 months after the alleged accident. It seemed to everyone that Denise had come to terms with the loss of her husband, but Mike's mother had not. 6 months later, in June 2001, an angler discovered wading boots floating in the lake. Divers searched the lake area and retrieved a lightweight hunting jacket and flashlight from the bottom. In one of the jacket's pockets was a hunting license with Williams's name and signature. The find raised many questions. Neither the hunting jacket nor the boots had visible teeth marks indicative of an alligator attack. None of the items found showed signs of having been in the water for 6 months. The boots were not slimy and the flashlight still worked. However, a week later, Denise's attorney asked the court to declare Mike Williams dead. Based on the items found, he suggested that alligators and other aquatic life had swallowed the body whole. The motion was granted. The death certificate said Mike died on December 16, 2000. Cause of death: accidental drowning while duck hunting on Lake Seminole. The body has yet to be recovered. This is how Mike Williams' story might have ended if not for Cheryl Williams, who refused to give up and continued to search for her son. "All I know is that I can't stop looking for him until I find him," she said. Cheryl's efforts seriously strained her relationship with her former sister-in-law. Denise demanded she stop searching and accept reality. She said, "I'm tired of seeing articles about Mike and his disappearance. I just want to move on with my life. If you keep pushing this investigation, you will never see your granddaughter again." Cheryl couldn't give up on her son, and Denise carried out her threat. If not for the mother's persistence, her son's story might have remained submerged at the bottom of a dark, algae-covered lake. It took Cheryl Williams 3 years to convince law enforcement officials to open an investigation into her young son's disappearance. "I made phone calls, put up signs about my missing son, wrote to the governor of Florida every day, compiled my notes into an evidence book, asked people to post on social media, and contacted reporters," Cheryl will tell you years later. The persistent mother contacted Matthew Oresco, an alligator expert. In his response, He explained that alligators do not feed during the cold winter months. Cold weather causes water temperatures to drop, so alligators don't feed in the winter. All they do is maintain their body temperature. 14 degrees is too cold for an alligator to be interested in food at all. Moreover, Oresco wrote that after an alligator kill, there is always forensic evidence left behind. Eventually, after 3 years, Cheryl Williams convinced law enforcement to drop the ridiculous alligator theory and launch an official investigation into her son's disappearance. The case was reopened because of little-known facts regarding alligators' eating habits. Evidence gathered from interviews and a little official data convinced investigators that Williams' death was no accident. My gut feeling is that Mike did not die in Lake Seminole, and that's the general consensus of all the law enforcement agencies working on this case, said Ronnie Austin, a former investigator with the 2nd District State's Attorney's Office who prosecuted Mike's case. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Agency initially took over the case because Williams was considered a missing hunter. Officers spent 735 hours searching a 10-acre section of the lake for the body, but didn't spend a minute looking for signs of wrongdoing. Jackson County Sheriff's deputies brought in to help with the search also did not consider other possibilities. Investigators interviewed everyone involved in the search, and police officer David Arnett, who was present at the scene that day, years later said, "Some things immediately looked strange. Williams didn't usually hunt alone. His truck was found in an undeveloped area from which he would have had to drag the boat over mud, not on the nearby concrete boat launch he usually used. The terrible storm that night should have pushed the boat to the east shore, but it was found on the west shore. The boat's motor wasn't running, but it was full of gasoline. If Mike had been driving the boat and fell out of it, it would have continued to float in circles until it ran out of gas." Unfortunately, law enforcement began to doubt too late that they were dealing with a simple drowning. The crime scene had already been trampled by numerous volunteers and searchers. A car that could have served as a clue was taken by the family without any verification. Potential witnesses were missed. Denise Williams and Brian Winchester became suspicious to investigators because they learned that Winchester had divorced his wife Kathy and married Denise. They also learned of Denise's unexpected financial gain of nearly $2 million from her late husband's life insurance policy. Detectives determined that it was Winchester who sold the policy to Mike. They also found it strange that Denise, as Mike's wife, did not want to have anything to do with the investigation and tried to prevent Cheryl's activity, even forbidding the grandmother to communicate with her granddaughter. In 2005, the newly married couple were called in for questioning, which gave nothing new to the investigation. Brian provided an alibi for the morning of the disappearance of Mike Williams. He said he was 60 miles from the lake, at home, in bed, as his ex-wife Kathy could attest. He said he had intended to go hunting with his father-in-law in the morning, but overslept. Denise's interrogation also yielded no new leads. In 2008, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement announced that Mike's disappearance was not an accident, and they believe he was the victim of a crime. However, without sufficient evidence, they alas cannot prosecute. We have suspicions, but we need proof. Another investigation failed to find out her son's fate, but Cheryl Williams did not give up again. Her efforts led to the Discovery Cable Channel doing a story on Mike's disappearance and subsequent investigations in late 2011. By then, Cheryl had become disillusioned with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, believing it was either incompetent or uninterested in solving the case. Beginning in 2012, Mike's mother wrote about 1 letter a day to the governor, Rick Scott, asking him to either assign the investigation to another agency or appoint a special prosecutor to do so. Cheryl sent 2,600 letters to the governor over 9 years. In 2012, Denise caught Brian cheating and they broke up. The following year, Denise filed for divorce. After a few more years, an appraisal of the former family home was to take place, after which even property issues would no longer bind them. This event was a turning point in Mike's case. Brian didn't want a divorce. Denise didn't want to continue the relationship. They were constantly fighting, and the Williams investigation was poking fun at them. Brian would call Denise and she stopped returning his calls. He couldn't handle the stress level. On August 5, 2016, the day a real estate appraisal was due as part of a court order, Denise left her home to drive to work at Florida State University. While talking to her sister on the phone, she saw someone climb over the back seat of her car. It turned out to be Winchester. Ryan pressed a loaded gun against Denise's ribs and told her to drive straight ahead. He said he had to do that because she wasn't answering his calls. Denise tried to calm Brian down, agreed with everything he said, and promised to give him a chance to save their marriage. Brian believed it. Denise assured him that she wouldn't go to the police and report what he had just done, and Brian got out of the car. As he got out, he took the brown sheet, plastic sheeting, bleach sprayer, and tools with him. It became clear that Denise had miraculously escaped death. Denise called emergency services. Brian was quickly arrested and charged with kidnapping, which is a first-degree felony in Florida and carries a life sentence as the maximum penalty. He was also charged with domestic violence and armed burglary. The court decided to keep Brian in custody without bail. Cheryl Williams expressed hope that this development will lead to the solving of her son's disappearance case. "Brian is not going to let Denise run around alone with all that money," she told the New York Daily News. "I pray that he will tell us what really happened." And Brian did tell, bargaining himself an extremely favorable deal with the prosecutor and avoiding a life sentence. "At first, I think we were all doing really well, but I wasn't a good husband," Brian began his story. "One day, I found a note in my first wife Kathy's purse and realized she was cheating on me. I wanted revenge. We often went to bars and concerts with Denise and Mike. I had been friends with Denise since high school. I was never really attracted to her. But after Kathy cheated on me, I started looking at other women differently." The affair between Brian and Denise began in October 1997. One-time drunken sex at a rock concert quickly escalated to frequent secret meetings. "We started meeting at hotels. During the workday, we met whenever we had the opportunity." Brian recounted. He did not want a divorce. Denise made it clear that she would never divorce her husband. Public opinion was important to her, and she did not want to share custody of her daughter. Over time, the affair became more than just meeting for casual sex. Denise and Brian thought of themselves as a couple, exchanging gifts and love letters. It became clear that they couldn't go on like this. They could not be without each other, and divorce was unacceptable to Denise. Her pious image was not to be harmed. Around this time, Mike almost died in a hunting accident. Brian saved him, and Denise suddenly saw a way out of the situation. After the deal with the prosecutor, Brian will reveal, "The year 2000 prompted us to start talking about Mike and Kathy's death. Denise wanted it all on me, not her, and she wanted a scenario where it wasn't a murder but an accident. She wanted death to be left up to God. That way she could live with it." After considering various options, Brian and Denise settled on a boating accident. In doing so, they timed the murder so that they could get the maximum possible payout on Mike's life insurance policy. They both realized that Mike had to be killed before one of the 3 policies expired at the end of December 2000. The plan was in place. Brian called his friend to go hunting. He said he'd found a great spot on the shores of Lake Seminole. Mike expected to go there with Brian and return home by noon to celebrate his anniversary with his wife. "I told him that we were going to go to a special place and that he absolutely had to bring his wading boots with him. I had to make sure he took them with him because it was believed that if you fell overboard in wading boots, you would drown very quickly. The plan was to make death look like an accidental drowning. Once Brian and Mike were in the water, Brian pushed Mike out of the boat, but instead of sinking, he grabbed onto the stumps and began to wade through them to the shore. Brian panicked. "I didn't know what to do." Mike started calling loudly for help. "I didn't know how to get out of this situation. I had a shotgun. I was panicking and I shot him in the head. I didn't think about what I was doing. Things didn't go according to plan, and I needed to cover up what happened. There was hardly any time left. I should have been back home by now and getting ready to go hunting with my father-in-law. No one knew I was at the lake with Mike, so I decided it would be best for me to drive home and pretend like I had overslept. I drove home and hoped that Kathy was still asleep. I entered the house as quietly as I could. Katie was asleep. My phone was on the floor. I went to bed, called my father-in-law, and apologized." Brian did everything he could to create an alibi for himself. Then he hid the body. Denise didn't know that Brian had shot Mike in the head and buried him. Brian tried to tell her, but she didn't want to listen. It was enough for her that her husband was gone. Denise wanted to go on living with the idea that it was God who kept him from swimming out and let him drown. According to Brian, they promised each other that neither of them would ever say anything. Denise and Brian justified what happened by saying that the main reason Mike was killed was because it was impossible for them to live together. "We said the money was just the cherry on the cake," Brian would pronounce in court. Investigators learned that it was Brian who planted a hat, boots, flashlight, and license. First, he needed to keep searchers from leaving the lake, and afterwards he needed grounds to pronounce Mike dead so Denise could get insurance, since a recognition process usually takes about 5 years. The lovers managed it in just 7 months. Including Social Security and other benefits, Denise received about $2 million. On May 8, 2018, Denise Williams was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory to a felony, which carried a life sentence. Denise pleaded not guilty to all 3 charges. In February 2019, she was sentenced to life in prison. 5 months later, Mike and Denise's daughter, Ansley, received all of her late father's assets and insurance money owed to Denise. In January 2020, Denise Williams appealed the conviction and life sentence. Her attorney argued before Florida's First District Court of Appeal that there was no evidence that she was involved in committing the murder. In November 2020, the murder conviction was overturned, but the 30-year sentence for conspiracy to commit murder was upheld. Denise is now in custody at the Florida Women's Reception Center. She will be 78 years old when she is released. Brian Winchester was transferred to Madison Correctional Institute in Florida to serve the remainder of his sentence. His current release date is set for July 30th, 2036. He will be 67 years old. Ansley, daughter of Mike and Denise, insists her mother is innocent and places the blame on Brian Winchester. She refused to speak to any media regarding the outcome of the case and her personal life. According to Cheryl and Nick, Ansley's uncle, they have not been able to connect with Ansley. Cheryl is very sorry that she has lost not only her son, but also her granddaughter.